Chapter 44 of David Copperfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 44. Our Housekeeping. It was a strange condition of things, the honeymoon being over and the bridesmaids gone home, when I found myself sitting down in my small house with Dora, quite thrown out of employment, as I may say, in respect of the delicious old occupation of making love. It seemed such an extraordinary thing to have Dora always there. It was so unaccountable not to be obliged to go out to see her, not to have any occasion to be tormenting myself about her, not to have to write to her, not to be scheming and devising opportunities of being alone with her. Sometimes of an evening, when I looked up from my writing and saw her seated opposite, I would lean back in my chair and think how queer it was that there we were, alone together as a matter of course, nobody's business any more, all the romance of our engagement put away upon a shelf to rust, no one to please but one another to please for life. When there was a debate and I was kept out very late, it seemed so strange to me as I was walking home to think that Dora was at home. It was such a wonderful thing at first to have her come softly down to talk to me as I ate my supper. It was such a stupendous thing to know for certain that she put her hair in papers. It was altogether such an astonishing event to see her do it. I doubt whether two young birds could have known less about keeping house than I and my pretty Dora did. We had a servant, of course. She kept house for us. I have still a latent belief that she must have been Mrs. Crupp's daughter in disguise. We had such an awful time of it with Mary Ann. Her name was Paragon. Her nature was represented to us when we engaged her as being feebly expressed in her name. She had a written character as large as a proclamation, and according to this document could do everything of a domestic nature that ever I heard of, and a great many things I never did hear of. She was a woman in the prime of life, of a severe countenance, and subject, particularly in the arms, to a sort of perpetual measles or fiery rash. She had a cousin in the Life Guards, with such long legs that he looked like the afternoon shadow of somebody else. His shell jacket was as much too little for him as he was too big for the premises. He made the cottage smaller than it need have been, by being so very much out of proportion to it. Besides which, the walls were not thick, and whenever he passed the evening at our house, we always knew of it by hearing one continual growl in the kitchen. Our treasure was warranted sober and honest. I am therefore willing to believe that she was in a fit when we found her under the boiler, and that the deficient teaspoons were attributable to the dustman. But she preyed upon our minds dreadfully. We felt our inexperience, and were unable to help ourselves. We should have been at her mercy if she had had any, but she was a remorseless woman, and had none. She was the cause of our first little quarrel. "My dearest life," said I one day to Dora, "do you think Mary Ann has any idea of time?" "Why, Dodie?" inquired Dora, looking up innocently from her drawing. "My love, because it's 5, and we were to have dined at 4. Dora glanced wistfully at the clock, and hinted that she thought it was too fast. "On the contrary, my love," said I, referring to my watch, "it's a few minutes too slow." My little wife came and sat upon my knee, to coax me to be quiet, and drew a line with her pencil down the middle of my nose, but I couldn't dine off that, though it was very agreeable. "Don't you think, my dear," said I, "it would be better for you to remonstrate with Mary Ann?" "Oh no, please, I couldn't, Dodie," said Dora. "Why not, my love?" I gently asked. "Oh, because I am such a little goose," said Dora, "and she knows I am." I thought this sentiment so incompatible with the establishment of my system of check on Mary Ann that I frowned a little. "Oh, what ugly wrinkles in my bad boy's forehead," said Dora, and still being on my knee she traced them with her pencil, putting it to her rosy lips to make it mark blacker, and working at my forehead with a quaint little mockery of being industrious, that quite delighted me in spite of myself. "There's a good child," said Dora. "It makes its face so much prettier to laugh." "But, my love," said I. "No, no, please," cried Dora with a kiss. "Don't be a naughty Bluebeard. Don't be serious."
"My precious wife," said I, "we must be serious sometimes. Come, sit down on this chair close beside me. Give me the pencil. There. Now, let us talk sensibly. You know, dear,
What a little hand it was to hold, and what a tiny wedding ring it was to see. You know, my love, it is not exactly comfortable to have to go out without one's dinner, now is it?' 'No,' replied Dora faintly. 'My love, how you tremble!' 'Because I know you are going to scold me!' exclaimed Dora in a piteous voice. 'My sweet, I am only going to reason.' 'Oh, but reasoning is worse than scolding!' exclaimed Dora in despair. 'I didn't marry to be reasoned with. If you meant to reason with such a poor little thing as I am, you ought to have told me so, you cruel boy!' I tried to pacify Dora, but she turned away her face and shook her curls from side to side and said, 'You cruel, cruel boy!' so many times that I really did not exactly know what to do. So I took a few turns up and down the room in my uncertainty and came back again. 'Dora, my darling.' 'No, I am not your darling, because you must be sorry that you married me, or else you wouldn't reason with me,' returned Dora. I felt so injured by the inconsequential nature of this charge that it gave me courage to be grave. 'Now, my Dora,' said I, 'you are very childish, and you are talking nonsense. You must remember, I am sure, that I was obliged to go out yesterday when dinner was half over, and that the day before I was made quite unwell by being obliged to eat underdone veal in a hurry. Today I don't dine at all, and I am afraid to say how long we waited for breakfast, and then the water didn't boil. I don't mean to reproach you, my dear, but this is not comfortable.' 'Oh, you cruel, cruel boy, to say I am a disagreeable wife!' cried Dora. 'Now, my dear Dora, you must know that I never said that.' 'You said I wasn't comfortable!' cried Dora. 'I said the housekeeping was not comfortable.' 'It's exactly the same thing!' cried Dora, and she evidently thought so, for she wept most grievously. I took another turn across the room, full of love for my pretty wife, and distracted by self-accusatory inclinations to knock my head against the door. I sat down again and said, 'I am not blaming you, Dora. We have both a great deal to learn. I am only trying to show you, my dear, that you really must, I was resolved not to give this up, accustom yourself to look after Mary Ann, likewise to act a little for yourself and me.' 'I wonder, I do, at your making such ungrateful speeches,' sobbed Dora. 'When you know that the other day, when you said you would like a little bit of fish, I went out myself miles and miles and ordered it to surprise you.' 'And it was very kind of you, my own darling,' said I. 'I felt it so much that I wouldn't on any account even have mentioned that you bought a salmon, which was too much for two, or that it cost £1.6, which was more than we can afford.' 'You enjoyed it very much,' sobbed Dora, 'and said I was a mouse.' 'And I'll say so again, my love,' I returned, 1,000 times.' But I had wounded Dora's soft little heart, and she was not to be comforted. She was so pathetic in her sobbing and bewailing that I felt as if I had said I don't know what to hurt her. I was obliged to hurry away. I was kept out late, and I felt all night such pangs of remorse as made me miserable. I had the conscience of an assassin, and was haunted by a vague sense of enormous wickedness. It was 2 or 3 hours past midnight when I got home. I found my aunt in our house, sitting up for me. 'Is anything the matter, aunt?' said I, alarmed. 'Nothing, Trot,' she replied. 'Sit down, sit down. Little Blossom has been rather out of spirits, and I have been keeping her company, that's all.' I leaned my head upon my hand, and felt more sorry and downcast, as I sat looking at the fire, than I could have supposed possible so soon after the fulfilment of my brightest hopes. As I sat thinking, I happened to meet my aunt's eyes, which were resting on my face. There was an anxious expression in them, but it cleared directly. 'I assure you, aunt,' said I have been quite unhappy myself all night, to think of Dora being so. But I had no other intention than to speak to her tenderly and lovingly about our home affairs.' My aunt nodded encouragement. 'You must have patience, Trot,' said she. 'Of course, heaven knows I don't mean to be unreasonable, aunt.' 'No, no,' said my aunt, 'but little Blossom is a very tender little blossom, and the wind must be gentle with her.' I thanked my good aunt in my heart for her tenderness towards my wife, and I was sure that she knew I did. 'Don't you think, aunt,' said I, after some further contemplation of the fire, 'that you could advise and counsel Dora a little for our mutual advantage, now and then?' 'Trot,' returned my aunt with some emotion, 'no, don't ask me such a thing.' Her tone was so very earnest that I raised my eyes in surprise. "I look back upon my life, child," said my aunt, "and I think of some who are in their graves, with whom I might have been on kinder terms. If I judged harshly of other people's mistakes in marriage, it may have been because I had bitter reason to judge harshly of my own. Let it pass. I have been a grumpy, frumpy, wayward sort of a woman a good many years. I am still, and I always shall be. But you and I have done one another some good, Trot. At all events, you have done me good, my dear, and division must not come between us at this time of day." "Division between us!" cried I. "Child, child," said my aunt, smoothing her dress, "how soon it might come between us, or how unhappy I might make our little Blossom if I meddled in anything, a prophet couldn't say. I want our pet to like me, and be as gay as a butterfly. Remember your own home in that second marriage, and never do both me and her the injury you have hinted at." I comprehended at once that my aunt was right, and I comprehended the full extent of her generous feeling towards my dear wife. "These are early days, Trot," she pursued, "and Rome was not built in a day, nor in a year. You have chosen freely for yourself," a cloud passed over her face for a moment, I thought, "and you have chosen a very pretty and a very affectionate creature. It will be your duty, and it will be your pleasure too, of course I know that, I am not delivering a lecture, to estimate her, as you chose her, by the qualities she has, and not by the qualities she may not have. The latter you must develop in her if you can. If you cannot, child," here my aunt rubbed her nose, "you must accustom yourself to do without 'em. But remember, my dear, your future is between you two. No one can assist you. You are to work it out for yourselves. This is marriage, Trot, and heaven bless you both in it, for a pair of babes in the wood as you are." My aunt said this in a sprightly way, and gave me a kiss to ratify the blessing. "Now," said she, "light my little lantern, and see me into my bandbox by the garden path," for there was a communication between our cottages in that direction. "Give Betsy Trotwood's love to the Blossom when you come back, and whatever you do, Trot, never dream of setting Betsy up as a scarecrow, for if I ever saw her in the glass, she's quite grim enough and gaunt enough in her private capacity." With this my aunt tied her head up in a handkerchief, with which she was accustomed to make a bundle of it on such occasions, and I escorted her home. As she stood in her garden, holding up her little lantern to light me back, I thought her observation of me had an anxious air again. But I was too much occupied in pondering on what she had said, and too much impressed for the first time in reality by the conviction that Dora and I had indeed to work out our future for ourselves, and that no one could assist us, to take much notice of it. Dora came stealing down in her little slippers to meet me, now that I was alone, and cried upon my shoulder, and said I had been hard-hearted, and she had been naughty, and I said much the same thing in effect, I believe, and we made it up, and agreed that our first little difference was to be our last, and that we were never to have another if we lived 100 years. The next domestic trial we went through was the Ordeal of Servants. Mary Ann's cousin deserted into our coal-hole, and was brought out, to our great amazement, by a piquet of his companions in arms, who took him away handcuffed in a procession that covered our front garden with ignominy. This nerved me to get rid of Mary Ann, who went so mildly on receipt of wages that I was surprised, until I found out about the teaspoons, and also about the little sum she had borrowed in my name of the tradespeople without authority. After an interval of Mrs. Kidgerbury, the oldest inhabitant of Kentish Town, I believe, who went out charing, but was too feeble to execute her conceptions of that art, we found another treasure, who was one of the most amiable of women, and who generally made a point of falling either up or down the kitchen stairs with a tray, and almost plunged into the parlour, as into a bath, with her tea-things. The ravages committed by this unfortunate rendering her dismissal necessary, she was succeeded, with intervals of Mrs. Kidgerbury, by a long line of incapables, terminating in a young person of genteel appearance, who went to Greenwich Fair in Dora's bonnet, after whom I remember nothing but an average equality of failure. Everybody we had anything to do with seemed to cheat us. Our appearance in a shop was a signal for the damaged goods to be brought out immediately. If we bought a lobster, it was full of water. All our meat turned out to be tough, and there was hardly any crust to our loaves. In search of the principle on which joints ought to be roasted enough and not too much, I myself referred to the cookery book, and found it there established as the allowance of 1/4 of an hour to every pound, and say 1/4 over. But the principle always failed us by some curious fatality, and we never could hit any medium between redness and cinders. I had reason to believe that in accomplishing these failures we incurred a far greater expense than if we had achieved a series of triumphs. It appeared to me, on looking over the tradesmen's books, as if we might have kept the basement story paved with butter. Such was the extensive scale of our consumption of that article. I don't know whether the excise duties of the period may have exhibited any increase in the demand for pepper, but if our performances did not affect the market, I should say several families must have left off using it. And the most wonderful fact of all was that we never had anything in the house. As to the washerwoman pawning the clothes and coming in a state of penitent intoxication to apologize, I suppose that might have happened several times to anybody. Also the chimney on fire, the parish engine, and perjury on the part of the beadle. But I apprehend that we were personally fortunate in engaging a servant with a taste for cordials, who swelled our running account for porter at the public house by such inexplicable items as quartern rum shrub, Mrs. C., quartern gin and cloves, Mrs. C., glass rum and peppermint, Mrs. C., the parenthesis always referring to Dora, who was supposed, it appeared on explanation, to have imbibed the whole of these refreshments. One of our first feats in the housekeeping way was a little dinner to Traddles. I met him in town, and asked him to walk out with me that afternoon. He readily consenting, I wrote to Dora, saying I would bring him home. It was pleasant weather, and on the road we made my domestic happiness the theme of conversation. Traddles was very full of it, and said that, picturing himself with such a home, and Sophy waiting and preparing for him, he could think of nothing wanting to complete his bliss. I could not have wished for a prettier little wife at the opposite end of the table, but I certainly could have wished, when we sat down, for a little more room. I did not know how it was, but though there were only two of us, we were at once always cramped for room, and yet had always enough room to lose everything in. I suspect it may have been because nothing had a place of its own, except Jip's pagoda, which invariably blocked up the main thoroughfare. On the present occasion, Traddles was so hemmed in by the pagoda and the guitar case, and Dora's flower painting and my writing table, that I had serious doubts of the possibility of his using his knife and fork, but he protested, with his own good humour, "Oceans of room, Copperfield! I assure you, oceans!" There was another thing I could have wished, namely, that Jip had never been encouraged to walk about the tablecloth during dinner. I began to think there was something disorderly in his being there at all, even if he had not been in the habit of putting his foot in the salt or the melted butter. On this occasion he seemed to think he was introduced expressly to keep Traddles at bay, and he barked at my old friend and made short runs at his plate with such undaunted pertinacity that he may be said to have engrossed the conversation. However, as I knew how tender-hearted my dear Dora was, and how sensitive she would be to any slight upon her favourite, I hinted no objection. For similar reasons I made no allusion to the skirmishing plates upon the floor, or to the disreputable appearance of the casters, which were all at 6s and 7s, and looked drunk, or to the further blockade of Traddles by wandering vegetable dishes and jugs. I could not help wondering in my own mind, as I contemplated the boiled leg of mutton before me, previous to carving it, how it came to pass that our joints of meat were of such extraordinary shapes, and whether a butcher contracted for all the deformed sheep that came into the world. But I kept my reflections to myself. "My love," I said to Dora, "what have you got in that dish?" I could not imagine why Dora had been making tempting little faces at me, as if she wanted to kiss me. "Oysters, dear," said Dora timidly. "Was that your thought?" said I, delighted. "Yes, Dodie," said Dora. "There never was a happier one," I exclaimed, laying down the carving knife and fork. "There is nothing Traddles likes so much." "Yes, Dodie," said Dora, "and so I bought a beautiful little barrel of them, and the man said they were very good, but I am afraid there's something the matter with them. They don't seem right." Here Dora shook her head, and diamonds twinkled in her eyes. "They are only opened in both shells," said I. "Take the top one off, my love." "But it won't come off," said Dora, trying very hard and looking very much distressed. "Do you know, Copperfield," said Traddles, cheerfully examining the dish, "I think this is in consequence, they are capital oysters, but I think it is in consequence of their never having been opened." They never had been opened, and we had no oyster knives, and couldn't have used them if we had, so we looked at the oysters and ate the mutton. At least, we ate as much of it as was done, and made up with capers. If I had permitted him, I am satisfied that Traddles would have made a perfect savage of himself, and eaten a plateful of raw meat to express enjoyment of the repast. But I would hear of no such immolation on the altar of friendship, and we had a course of bacon instead, there happening by good fortune to be cold bacon in the larder. My poor little wife was in such affliction when she thought I should be annoyed, and in such a state of joy when she found I was not, that the discomfiture I had subdued very soon vanished, and we passed a happy evening, Dora sitting with her arm on my chair while Traddles and I discussed a glass of wine, and taking every opportunity of whispering in my ear that it was good of me not to be a cruel, cross old boy. By and by she made tea for us, which it was so pretty to see her do, as if she was busying herself with a set of doll's tea things, that I was not particular about the quality of the beverage. Then Traddles and I played a game or two of cribbage, and Dora singing to the guitar the while. It seemed to me as if our courtship and marriage were a tender dream of mine, and the night when I first listened to her voice were not yet over. When Traddles went away, and I came back into the parlour from seeing him out, my wife planted her chair close to mine, and sat down by my side. "I am very sorry," she said. "Will you try to teach me, Dodie?" "I must teach myself first, Dora," said I. "I am as bad as you, love." "Ah, but you can learn," she returned, "and you are a clever, clever man." "Nonsense, mouse," said I. "I wish," resumed my wife after a long silence, "that I could have gone down into the country for a whole year, and lived with Agnes." Her hands were clasped upon my shoulder, and her chin rested on them, and her blue eyes looked quietly into mine. "Why so?" I asked. "I think she might have improved me, and I think I might have learned from her," said Dora. "All in good time, my love. Agnes has had her father to take care of these many years, you should remember. Even when she was quite a child, she was the Agnes whom we know," said I. "Will you call me a name I want you to call me?" inquired Dora without moving. "What is it?" I asked with a smile. "It's a stupid name," she said, shaking her curls for a moment. "Child wife." I laughingly asked my child wife what her fancy was in desiring to be so called. She answered without moving, otherwise than as the arm I twined about her may have brought her blue eyes nearer to me. "I don't mean, you silly fellow, that you should use the name instead of Dora. I only mean that you should think of me that way. When you are going to be angry with me, say to yourself, 'It's only my child wife.' When I am very disappointing, say, 'I knew a long time ago that you would make but a child wife.' When you miss what I should like to be, and I think can never be, say, 'Still my foolish child wife loves me,' for indeed I do." I had not been serious with her, having no idea until now that she was serious herself, but her affectionate nature was so happy in what I now said to her with my whole heart, that her face became a laughing one before her glittering eyes were dry. She was soon my child wife indeed, sitting down on the floor outside the Chinese house, ringing all the little bells one after another to punish Jip for his recent bad behaviour, while Jip lay blinking in the doorway with his head out, even too lazy to be teased. This appeal of Dora's made a strong impression on me. I look back on the time I write of. I invoke the innocent figure that I dearly loved to come out from the mists and shadows of the past, and turn its gentle head towards me once again. And I can still declare that this one little speech was constantly in my memory. I may not have used it to the best account. I was young and inexperienced, but I never turned a deaf ear to its artless pleading. Dora told me shortly afterwards that she was going to be a wonderful housekeeper. Accordingly, she polished the tablets, pointed the pencil, bought an immense account book, carefully stitched up with a needle and thread all the leaves of the cookery book which Jip had torn, and made quite a desperate little attempt to be good, as she called it. But the figures had the old obstinate propensity. They would not add up. When she had entered 2 or 3 laborious items in the account book, Jip would walk over the page wagging his tail, and smear them all out. Her own little right-hand middle finger got steeped to the very bone in ink, and I think that was the only decided result obtained. Sometimes of an evening, when I was at home and at work, for I wrote a good deal now, and was beginning in a small way to be known as a writer, I would lay down my pen and watch my child wife trying to be good. First of all, she would bring out the immense account book and lay it down upon the table with a deep sigh. Then she would open it at the place where Jip had made it illegible last night, and call Jip up to look at his misdeeds. This would occasion a diversion in Jip's favour, and some inking of his nose perhaps, as a penalty. Then she would tell Jip to lie down on the table instantly, like a lion, which was one of his tricks, though I cannot say the likeness was striking, and if he were in an obedient humour he would obey. Then she would take up a pen and begin to write, and find a hair in it. Then she would take up another pen and begin to write, and find that it spluttered. Then she would take up another pen and begin to write, and say in a low voice, "Oh, it's a talking pen, and will disturb Dodie." And then she would give it up as a bad job and put the account book away, after pretending to crush the lion with it. Or if she were in a very sedate and serious state of mind, she would sit down with the tablets and a little basket of bills and other documents, which looked more like curl papers than anything else, and endeavour to get some result out of them. After severely comparing one with another, and making entries on the tablets, and blotting them out, and counting on all the fingers of her left hand over and over again, backwards and forwards, she would be so vexed and discouraged, and would look so unhappy, that it gave me pain to see her bright face clouded, and for me, and I would go softly to her and say, "What's the matter, Dora?" Dora would look up hopelessly and reply, "They won't come right. They make my head ache so, and they won't do anything I want." Then I would say, "Now let us try together. Let me show you, Dora." Then I would commence a practical demonstration, to which Dora would pay profound attention, perhaps for 5 minutes, when she would begin to be dreadfully tired, and would lighten the subject by curling my hair, or trying the effect of my face with my shirt collar turned down. If I tacitly checked this playfulness and persisted, she would look so scared and disconsolate as she became more and more bewildered, that the remembrance of her natural gaiety when I first strayed into her path, and of her being my child wife, would come reproachfully upon me, and I would lay the pencil down and call for the guitar. I had a great deal of work to do, and had many anxieties, but the same considerations made me keep them to myself. I am far from sure now that it was right to do this, but I did it for my child wife's sake. I search my breast, and I committed secrets, if I know them, without any reservation, to this paper. The old unhappy loss or want of something had, I am conscious, some place in my heart, but not to the embitterment of my wife. When I walked alone in the fine weather, and thought of the summer days when all the air had been filled with my boyish enchantment, I did miss something of the realization of my dreams, but I thought it was a softened glory of the past, which nothing could have thrown upon the present time. I did feel sometimes, for a little while, that I could have wished my wife had been my counsellor, had had more character and purpose to sustain me and improve me by, had been endowed with power to fill up the void which somewhere seemed to be about me. But I felt as if this were an unearthly consummation of my happiness, that never had been meant to be, and never could have been. I was a boyish husband as to years. I had known the softening influence of no other sorrows or experiences than those recorded in these leaves. If I did any wrong, as I may have done much, I did it in mistaken love, and in my want of wisdom. I write the exact truth. It would avail me nothing to extenuate it now. Thus it was that I took upon myself the toils and cares of our life, and had no partner in them. We lived much as before, in reference to our scrambling household arrangements, but I had got used to those, and Dora, I was pleased to see, was seldom vexed now. She was bright and cheerful in the old childish way, and loved me dearly, and was happy with her old trifles. When the debates were heavy, I mean as to length, not quality, for in the last respect they were not often otherwise, and I went home late, Dora would never rest when she heard my footsteps, but would always come downstairs to meet me. When my evenings were unoccupied by the pursuit for which I had qualified myself with so much pains, and I was engaged in writing at home, she would sit quietly near me, however late the hour, and be so mute that I would often think she had dropped asleep. But generally, when I raised my head, I saw her blue eyes looking at me with the quiet attention of which I have already spoken. "Oh, what a weary boy!" said Dora one night when I met her eyes as I was shutting up my desk. "What a weary girl!" said I. "That's more to the purpose. You must go to bed another time, my love. It's far too late for you." "No, don't send me to bed," pleaded Dora, coming to my side. "Pray don't do that." "Dora!" To my amazement she was sobbing on my neck. "Not well, my dear? Not happy?" "Yes, quite well, and very happy," said Dora. "But say you let me stop and see you write." "Why, what a sight for such bright eyes at midnight!" I replied. "Are they bright, though?" returned Dora, laughing. "I'm so glad they're bright." "Little vanity," said I. But it was not vanity. It was only harmless delight in my admiration. I knew that very well before she told me so. "If you think them pretty, say I may always stop and see you write," said Dora. "Do you think them pretty?" "Very pretty." "Then let me always stop and see you write." "I'm afraid that won't improve their brightness, Dora." "Yes, it will, because, you clever boy, you'll not forget me then, while you are full of silent fancies. Will you mind it if I say something very, very silly? More than usual?" inquired Dora, peeping over my shoulder into my face. "What wonderful thing is that?" said I. "Please let me hold the pens," said Dora. "I want to have something to do with all those many hours when you were so industrious. May I hold the pens?" The remembrance of her pretty joy when I said yes brings tears into my eyes. The next time I sat down to write, and regularly afterwards, she sat in her old place with a spare bundle of pens at her side. Her triumph in this connection with my work, and her delight when I wanted a new pen, which I very often feigned to do, suggested to me a new way of pleasing my child wife. I occasionally made a pretence of wanting a page or two of manuscript copied. Then Dora was in her glory. The preparation she made for this great work, the aprons she put on, the bib she borrowed from the kitchen to keep off the ink, the time she took, the innumerable stoppages she made to have a laugh with Jip, as if he understood it all, her conviction that her work was incomplete unless she signed her name at the end of it, the way in which she would bring it to me, like a school copy, and then, when I praised it, clasp me round the neck, are touching recollections to me, simple as they might appear to other men. She took possession of the keys soon after this, and went jingling about the house with the whole bunch in a little basket tied to her slender waist. I seldom found that the places to which they belonged were locked, or that they were of any use except as a plaything for Jip, but Dora was pleased, and that pleased me. She was quite satisfied that a good deal was effected by this make-believe of housekeeping, and was as merry as if we had been keeping a baby-house for a joke. So it went on. Dora was hardly less affectionate to my aunt than to me, and often told her of the time when she was afraid she was a cross old thing. I never saw my aunt unbend more systematically to anyone. She courted Jip, though Jip never responded, listened day after day to the guitar. I am afraid she had no taste for music, never attacked the incapables, though the temptation must have been severe, went wonderful distances on foot to purchase, as surprises, any trifles that she found Dora wanted, and never came in by the garden and missed her from the room, but that she would call out at the foot of the stairs, in a voice that sounded cheerfully all over the house, "Where's little Blossom?" End of chapter 44.
Of David Copperfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 45. Mr. Dick fulfills my aunt's predictions. It was some time now since I had left the doctor. Living in his neighbourhood, I saw him frequently, and we all went to his house on 2 or 3 occasions, to dinner or tea. The old soldier was in permanent quarters under the doctor's roof. She was exactly the same as ever, and the same immortal butterflies hovered over her cap. Like some other mothers whom I have known in the course of my life, Mrs. Markleham was far more fond of pleasure than her daughter was. She required a great deal of amusement, and, like a deep old soldier, pretended, in consulting her own inclinations, to be devoting herself to her child. The doctor's desire that Annie should be entertained was therefore particularly acceptable to this excellent parent, who expressed unqualified approval of his discretion. I have no doubt indeed that she probed the doctor's wound without knowing it, meaning nothing but a certain matured frivolity and selfishness, not always inseparable from full-blown years. I think she confirmed him in his fear that he was a constraint upon his young wife, and that there was no congeniality of feeling between them, by so strongly commending his design of lightening the load of her life. "My dear soul," she said to him one day when I was present, "you know there is no doubt it would be a little poky for Annie to be always shut up here." The doctor nodded his benevolent head. "When she comes to her mother's age," said Mrs. Markleham, with a flourish of her fan, "then it'll be another thing. You might put me into a jail with genteel society and a rubber, and I should never care to come out. But I'm not Annie, you know, and Annie is not her mother." "Surely, surely," said the doctor. "You are the best of creatures. No, I beg your pardon," for the doctor made a gesture of deprecation. "I must say before your face, as I always say behind your back, you are the best of creatures. But of course you don't, now do you, enter into the same pursuits and fancies as Annie?" "No," said the doctor in a sorrowful tone. "No, of course not," retorted the old soldier. "Take your dictionary, for example. What a useful work a dictionary is, but what a necessary work! The meanings of words. Without Dr. Johnson, or somebody of that sort, we might have been at this present moment calling an Italian iron a bedstead. But we can't expect a dictionary, especially when it's making, to interest Annie, can we?" The doctor shook his head. "And that's why I so much approve," said Mrs. Markleham, tapping him on the shoulder with her shut-up fan, "of your thoughtfulness. It shows that you don't expect, as many elderly people do expect, old heads on young shoulders. You have studied Annie's character, and you understand it. That's what I find so charming." Even the calm and patient face of Dr. Strong expressed some little sense of pain, I thought, under the infliction of these compliments. "Therefore, my dear doctor," said the old soldier, giving him several affectionate taps, "you may command me at all times and seasons. Now, do understand that I am entirely at your service. I am ready to go with Annie to operas, concerts, exhibitions, all kinds of places, and you shall never find that I am tired. Duty, my dear doctor, before every consideration in the universe." She was as good as her word. She was one of those people who could bear a great deal of pleasure, and she never flinched in her perseverance in the cause. She seldom got hold of the newspaper, which she settled herself down in the softest chair in the house to read through an eyeglass every day for 2 hours, but she found out something that she was certain Annie would like to see. It was in vain for Annie to protest that she was weary of such things. Her mother's remonstrance always was, "Now, my dear Annie, I am sure you know better, and I must tell you, my love, that you are not making a proper return for the kindness of Dr. Strong." This was usually said in the doctor's presence, and appeared to me to constitute Annie's principal inducement for withdrawing her objections when she made any. But in general she resigned herself to her mother, and went where the old soldier would. It rarely happened now that Mr. Maldon accompanied them. Sometimes my aunt and Dora were invited to do so, and accepted the invitation. Sometimes Dora only was asked. The time had been when I should have been uneasy in her going, but reflection on what had passed that former night in the doctor's study had made a change in my mistrust. I believed that the doctor was right, and I had no worse suspicions. My aunt rubbed her nose sometimes when she happened to be alone with me, and said she couldn't make it out. She wished they were happier. She didn't think our military friend, so she always called the old soldier, mended the matter at all. My aunt further expressed her opinion that if our military friend would cut off those butterflies and give them to the chimney sweepers for May Day, it would look like the beginning of something sensible on her part. But her abiding reliance was on Mr. Dick. That man had evidently an idea in his head, she said, and if he could only once pen it up into a corner, which was his great difficulty, he would distinguish himself in some extraordinary manner. Unconscious of this prediction, Mr. Dick continued to occupy precisely the same ground in reference to the doctor and Mrs. Strong. He seemed neither to advance nor to recede. He appeared to have settled into his original foundation, like a building, and I must confess that my faith in his ever moving was not much greater than if he had been a building. But one night, when I had been married some months, Mr. Dick put his head into the parlour where I was writing alone, Dora having gone out with my aunt to take tea with the two little birds, and said with a significant cough, You couldn't speak to me without inconveniencing yourself, Trotwood, I'm afraid." "Certainly, Mr. Dick," said I. "Come in." "Trotwood," said Mr. Dick, laying his finger on the side of his nose after he had shaken hands with me, "before I sit down, I wish to make an observation. You know your aunt?" "A little," I replied. "She's the most wonderful woman in the world, sir." After the delivery of this communication, which he shot out of himself as if he were loaded with it, Mr. Dick sat down with greater gravity than usual, and looked at me. "Now, boy," said Mr. Dick, "I am going to put a question to you." "As many as you please," said I. "What do you consider me, sir?" asked Mr. Dick, folding his arms. "A dear old friend," said I. "Thank you, Trotwood," returned Mr. Dick, laughing, and reaching across in high glee to shake hands with me. "But I mean, boy," resuming his gravity, "what do you consider me in this respect?" touching his forehead. I was puzzled how to answer, but he helped me with a word. "Weak," said Mr. Dick. "Well," I replied dubiously, "rather so." "Exactly," cried Mr. Dick, who seemed quite enchanted by my reply. "That is, Trotwood, where they took some of the trouble out of you-know-whose head, and put it you-know-where." There was a Mr. Dick made his two hands revolve very fast about each other a great number of times, and then brought them into collision and rolled them over and over one another to express confusion. There was that sort of thing done to me, somehow, eh? I nodded at him, and he nodded back again. "In short, boy," said Mr. Dick, dropping his voice to a whisper, "I am simple." I would have qualified that conclusion, but he stopped me. "Yes, I am. She pretends I am not. She won't hear of it. But I am. I know I am. If she hadn't stood my friend, sir, I should have been shut up, and led a dismal life these many years. But I'll provide for her. I never spend the copying money. I put it in a box. I have made a will. I'll leave it all to her, and she shall be rich, noble." Mr. Dick took out his pocket handkerchief and wiped his eyes. He then folded it up with great care, pressed it smooth between his two hands, put it back in his pocket, and seemed to put my aunt away with it. "Now, you are a scholar, Trotwood," said Mr. Dick. "You are a fine scholar. You know what a learned man, what a great man the doctor is. You know what honour he has always done me, not proud in his wisdom. Humble, condescending even to poor Dick, who is simple and knows nothing. I have sent his name up on a scrap of paper to the kite along the string when it has been in the sky among the larks. The kite has been glad to receive it, sir, and the sky has been brighter with it." I delighted him by saying most heartily that the doctor was deserving of our best respect and highest esteem. "And his beautiful wife is a star," said Mr. Dick, "a shining star. I have seen her shine, sir, but," bringing his chair nearer and laying one hand upon my knee, "clouds, sir, clouds." I answered the solicitude which his face expressed by conveying the same expression into my own, and shaking my head. "What clouds?" said Mr. Dick. He looked so wistfully into my face, and was so anxious to understand, that I took great pains to answer him slowly and distinctly, as I might have entered on an explanation to a child. "There is some unfortunate division between them," I replied, "some unhappy cause of separation. A secret. It may be inseparable from the discrepancy in their years. It may have grown up out of almost nothing." Mr. Dick, who had told off every sentence with a thoughtful nod, paused when I had done, and sat considering with his eyes upon my face and his hand upon my knee. "Doctor not angry with her, Trotwood?" he said after some time. "No, devoted to her." "Then I have got it, boy," said Mr. Dick. The sudden exultation with which he slapped me on the knee, and leaned back in his chair with his eyebrows lifted up as high as he could possibly lift them, made me think him farther out of his wits than ever. He became as suddenly grave again, and, leaning forward as before, said, first respectfully taking out his pocket handkerchief, as if it really did represent my aunt, "Most wonderful woman in the world, Trotwood. Why has she done nothing to set things right?" "Too delicate and difficult a subject for such interference," I replied. "Fine scholar," said Mr. Dick, touching me with his finger. "Why has he done nothing?" "For the same reason," I returned. "Then I have got it, boy," said Mr. Dick, and he stood up before me, more exultingly than before, nodding his head and striking himself repeatedly on the breast, until one might have supposed that he had nearly nodded and struck all the breath out of his body. "A poor fellow with a craze, sir," said Mr. Dick, "a simpleton, a weak-minded person, pleasant company, you know," striking himself again, "may do what wonderful people may not do. I'll bring them together, boy. I'll try. They'll not blame me. They'll not object to me. They'll not mind what I do, if it's wrong. I'm only Mr. Dick, and who minds Dick? Dick's nobody. Phew!" He blew a slight contemptuous breath, as if he blew himself away. It was fortunate he had proceeded so far with his mystery, for we heard the coach stop at the little garden gate which brought my aunt and Dora home. "Not a word, boy," he pursued in a whisper. "Leave all the blame with Dick. Simple Dick. Mad Dick. I have been thinking, sir, for some time that I was getting it. Now I have got it. After what you have said to me, I am sure I have got it. All right?" Not another word did Mr. Dick utter on the subject, but he made a very telegraph of himself for the next half hour, to the great disturbance of my aunt's mind, to enjoin inviolable secrecy on me. To my surprise I heard no more about it for 2 or 3 weeks, though I was sufficiently interested in the result of his endeavours, descrying a strange gleam of good sense, I say nothing of good feeling, for that he always exhibited, in the conclusion to which he had come. At last I began to believe that, in the flighty and unsettled state of his mind, he had either forgotten his intention or abandoned it. One fair evening, when Dora was not inclined to go out, my aunt and I strolled up to the doctor's cottage. It was autumn, when there were no debates to vex the evening air, and I remember how the leaves smelt like our garden at Blunderstone as we trod them under foot, and how the old unhappy feeling seemed to go by on the sighing wind. It was twilight when we reached the cottage. Mrs. Strong was just coming out of the garden, where Mr. Dick yet lingered, busy with his knife, helping the gardener to point some stakes. The doctor was engaged with somebody in his study, but the visitor would be gone directly, Mrs. Strong said, and begged us to remain to see him. We went into the drawing-room with her, and sat down by the darkening window. There was never any ceremony about the visits of such old friends and neighbours as we were. We had not sat there many minutes when Mrs. Markleham, who usually contrived to be in a fuss about something, came bustling in with her newspaper in her hand, and said, out of breath, "My goodness gracious, Annie, why didn't you tell me there was someone in the study?" "My dear mamma," she quietly returned, "how could I know that you desired the information?" "Desired the information!" said Mrs. Markleham, sinking on the sofa. "I never had such a turn in all my life." "Have you been to the study then, mamma?" asked Annie. "Been to the study, my dear!" she returned emphatically. "Indeed I have. I came upon the amiable creature, if you'll imagine my feelings, Miss Trotwood and David, in the act of making his will." Her daughter looked round from the window quickly. "In the act, my dear Annie," repeated Mrs. Markleham, spreading the newspaper on her lap like a tablecloth, and patting her hands upon it, "of making his last will and testament. The foresight and affection of the dear! I must tell you how it was. I really must, in justice to the darling, for he's nothing less, tell you how it was. Perhaps you know, Miss Trotwood, that there never is a candle lighted in this house until one's eyes are literally falling out of one's head with being stretched to read the paper. And there is not a chair in this house in which a paper can be what I call read, except one in the study. This took me to the study, where I saw a light. I opened the door. In company with the doctor were 2 professional people, evidently connected with the law, and they were all 3 standing at the table, the darling doctor pen in hand. "This simply expresses, then," said the doctor, "Annie, my love, attend to the very words. This simply expresses, then, gentlemen, the confidence I have in Mrs. Strong, and gives her all unconditionally." One of the professional people replied, "And gives her all unconditionally." Upon that, with the natural feeling of a mother, I said, "Good God, I beg your pardon," fell over the doorstep, and came away through the little back passage where the pantry is. Mrs. Strong opened the window, and went out into the veranda, where she stood leaning against a pillar. "But now isn't it, Miss Trotwood, isn't it, David, invigorating," said Mrs. Markleham, mechanically following her with her eyes, "to find a man at Dr. Strong's time of life with the strength of mind to do this kind of thing?
It only shows how right I was. I said to Annie, when Dr. Strong paid a very flattering visit to myself, and made her the subject of a declaration and an offer, I said, my dear, there is no doubt whatever, in my opinion, with reference to a suitable provision for you, that Dr. Strong will do more than he binds himself to do. Here the bell rang, and we heard the sound of the visitors' feet as they went out. It's all over, no doubt, said the old soldier after listening. The dear creature has signed, sealed, and delivered, and his mind's at rest. Well, it may be. What a mind! Annie, my love, I am going to the study with my paper, for I am a poor creature without news. Miss Trotwood, David, pray come and see the doctor. I was conscious of Mr. Dix standing in the shadow of the room, shutting up his knife, when we accompanied her to the study, and of my aunt's rubbing her nose violently by the way, as a mild vent for her intolerance of our military friend. But who got first to the study, or how Mrs. Markleham settled herself in a moment in her easy chair, or how my aunt and I came to be left together near the door, unless her eyes were quicker than mine, and she held me back, I have forgotten, if I ever knew. But this I know, that we saw the doctor before he saw us, standing at his table among the folio volumes in which he delighted, resting his head calmly on his hand. That in the same moment we saw Mrs. Strong glide in, pale and trembling. That Mr. Dick supported her on his arm. That he laid his other hand upon the doctor's arm, causing him to look up with an abstracted air. That, as the doctor moved his head, his wife dropped down on one knee at his feet, and, with her hands imploringly lifted, fixed upon his face the memorable look I had never forgotten. That at this sight Mrs. Markleham dropped the newspaper, and stared more like a figurehead intended for a ship called the Astonishment than anything else I can think of. The gentleness of the doctor's manner and surprise, the dignity that mingled with the supplicating attitude of his wife, the amiable concern of Mr. Dick, and the earnestness with which my aunt said to herself, "That man mad?" triumphantly expressive of the misery from which she had saved him, I see and hear rather than remember as I write about it. "Doctor," said Mr. Dick, "what is it that's amiss? Look here." "Annie," cried the doctor, "not at my feet, my dear." "Yes," she said, "I beg and pray that no one will leave the room. Oh, my husband and father, break this long silence. Let us both know what it is that has come between us." Mrs. Markleham, by this time recovering the power of speech, and seeming to swell with family pride and motherly indignation, here exclaimed, "Annie, get up immediately, and don't disgrace everybody belonging to you by humbling yourself like that, unless you wish to see me go out of my mind on the spot." "Mamma," returned Annie, "waste no words on me, for my appeal is to my husband, and even you are nothing here." "Nothing!" exclaimed Mrs. Markleham. "Me nothing! The child has taken leave of her senses. Please get me a glass of water." I was too attentive to the doctor and his wife to give any heed to this request, and it made no impression on anybody else, so Mrs. Markleham panted, stared, and fanned herself. "Annie," said the doctor, tenderly taking her in his hands, "my dear, if any unavoidable change has come in the sequence of time upon our married life, you are not to blame. The fault is mine, and only mine. There is no change in my affection, admiration, and respect. I wish to make you happy. I truly love and honour you. Rise, Annie, pray." But she did not rise. After looking at him for a little while, she sank down closer to him, laid her arm across his knee, and dropping her head upon it, said, "If I have any friend here who can speak one word for me or for my husband in this matter, if I have any friend here who can give a voice to any suspicion that my heart has sometimes whispered to me, if I have any friend here who honours my husband, or has ever cared for me, and has anything within his knowledge, no matter what it is, that may help to mediate between us, I implore that friend to speak." There was a profound silence. After a few moments of painful hesitation, I broke the silence. "Mrs. Strong," said I, "there is something within my knowledge which I have been earnestly entreated by Dr. Strong to conceal, and have concealed until to-night. But I believe the time has come when it would be mistaken faith and delicacy to conceal it any longer, and when your appeal absolves me from his injunction." She turned her face towards me for a moment, and I knew I was right. I could not have resisted its entreaty, if the assurance that it gave me had been any less convincing. "Our future peace," she said, "may be in your hands. I trusted confidently to your not suppressing anything. I know beforehand that nothing you or anyone can tell me will show my husband's noble heart in any other light than one. Howsoever it may seem to you to touch me, disregard that. I will speak for myself before him, and before God afterwards." Thus earnestly besought, I made no reference to the doctor for his permission, but without any other compromise of the truth than a little softening of the coarseness of Uriah Heep, related plainly what had passed in that same room that night. The staring of Mrs. Markleham during the whole narration, and the shrill, sharp interjections with which she occasionally interrupted it, defy description. When I had finished, Annie remained for some few moments silent, with her head bent down as I have described. Then she took the doctor's hand, he was sitting in the same attitude as when we had entered the room, and pressed it to her breast and kissed it. Mr. Dick softly raised her, and she stood, when she began to speak, leaning on him, and looking down upon her husband, from whom she never turned her eyes. "All that has ever been in my mind since I was married," she said in a low, submissive, tender voice, "I will lay bare before you. I could not live and have one reservation, knowing what I know now." "Nay, Annie," said the doctor mildly, "I have never doubted you, my child. There is no need, my dear." "There is great need," she answered in the same way, "that I should open my whole heart before the soul of generosity and truth, whom, year by year and day by day, I have loved and venerated more and more, as heaven knows." "Really," interrupted Mrs. Markleham, "if I have any discretion at all—" "Which you haven't, you marplot," observed my aunt in an indignant whisper. "I must be permitted to observe that it cannot be requisite to enter into these details." "None but my husband can judge of that, mamma," said Annie, without removing her eyes from his face, "and he will hear me. If I say anything to give you pain, mamma, forgive me. I have borne pain first, often and long, myself." "Upon my word!" gasped Mrs. Markleham. "When I was very young," said Annie, "quite a little child, my first associations with knowledge of any kind were inseparable from a patient friend and teacher, the friend of my dead father, who was always dear to me. I can remember nothing that I know without remembering him. He stored my mind with its first treasures, and stamped his character upon them all. They never could have been, I think, as good as they have been to me if I had taken them from any other hands." "Makes her mother nothing!" exclaimed Mrs. Markleham. "Not so, mamma," said Annie, "but I make him what he was. I must do that. As I grew up, he occupied the same place still. I was proud of his interest, deeply, fondly, gratefully attached to him. I looked up to him, I can hardly describe how, as a father, as a guide, as one whose praise was different from all other praise, as one in whom I could have trusted and confided if I had doubted all the world. You know, mamma, how young and inexperienced I was when you presented him before me, of a sudden, as a lover." "I have mentioned the fact 50 times at least to everybody here," said Mrs. Markleham. "Then hold your tongue, for the Lord's sake, and don't mention it any more," muttered my aunt. "It was so great a change, so great a loss, I felt it at first," said Annie, still preserving the same look and tone, "that I was agitated and distressed. I was but a girl, and when so great a change came in the character in which I had so long looked up to him, I think I was sorry. But nothing could have made him what he used to be again, and I was proud that he should think me so worthy, and we were married." "At St. Alphege, Canterbury," observed Mrs. Markleham. "Confound the woman," said my aunt, "she won't be quiet." "I never thought," proceeded Annie, with a heightened colour, "of any worldly gain that my husband would bring me. My young heart had no room in its homage for any such poor reference. Mamma, forgive me when I say that it was you who first presented to my mind the thought that any one could wrong me, and wrong him, by such a cruel suspicion." "Me!" cried Mrs. Markleham. "Ah, you to be sure," observed my aunt, "and you can't fan it away, my military friend." "It was the first unhappiness of my new life," said Annie. "It was the first occasion of every unhappy moment I have known. These moments have been more of late than I can count, but not, my generous husband, not for the reason you suppose, for in my heart there is not a thought, a recollection, or a hope that any power could separate from you." She raised her eyes and clasped her hands, and looked as beautiful and true, I thought, as Annie's spirit. The doctor looked on her henceforth as steadfastly as she on him. "Mamma is blameless," she went on, "of having ever urged you for herself, and she is blameless in intention every way, I am sure. But when I saw how many importunate claims were pressed upon you in my name, how you were traded on in my name, how generous you were, and how Mr. Wickfield, who had your welfare very much at heart, resented it, The first sense of my exposure to the mean suspicion that my tenderness was bought and sold to you, of all men on earth, fell upon me like unmerited disgrace, in which I forced you to participate. I cannot tell you what it was, mamma cannot imagine what it was, to have this dread and trouble always on my mind, yet know in my own soul that on my marriage day I crowned the love and honour of my life." "A specimen of the thanks one gets," cried Mrs. Markleham in tears, "for taking care of one's family. I wish I was a Turk." "I wish you were with all my heart, and in your native country," said my aunt. It was at that time that mamma was most solicitous about my cousin Maldon. I had liked him. She spoke softly, but without any hesitation, very much. We had been little lovers once. If circumstances had not happened otherwise, I might have come to persuade myself that I really loved him, and might have married him, and been most wretched. There can be no disparity in marriage like unsuitability of mind and purpose. I pondered on those words, even while I was studiously attending to what followed, as if they had some particular interest, or some strange application that I could not divine. There can be no disparity in marriage like unsuitability of mind and purpose. No disparity in marriage like unsuitability of mind and purpose. "There is nothing," said Annie, "that we have in common. I have long found that there is nothing. If I were thankful to my husband for no more, instead of for so much, I should be thankful to him for having saved me from the first mistaken impulse of my undisciplined heart." She stood quite still before the doctor, and spoke with an earnestness that thrilled me, yet her voice was just as quiet as before. "When he was waiting to be the object of your munificence, so freely bestowed for my sake, and when I was unhappy in the mercenary shape I was made to wear, I thought it would have become him better to have worked his own way on. I thought that if I had been he, I would have tried to do it, at the cost of almost any hardship. But I thought no worse of him until the night of his departure for India. That night I knew he had a false and thankless heart. I saw a double meaning then in Mr. Whitfield's scrutiny of me. I perceived for the first time the dark suspicion that shadowed my life." "Suspicion, Annie?" said the doctor. "No, no, no." "In your mind there was none, I know, my husband," she returned. "And when I came to you that night to lay down all my load of shame and grief, and knew that I had to tell you that underneath your roof one of my own kindred, to whom you had been a benefactor for the love of me, had spoken to me words that should have found no utterance, even if I had been the weak and mercenary wretch he thought me, my mind revolted from the taint the very tale conveyed. It died upon my lips, and from that hour till now has never passed them." Mrs. Markleham, with a short groan, leaned back in her easy chair, and retired behind her fan, as if she were never coming out any more. I have never, but in your presence, interchanged a word with him from that time, then only when it has been necessary for the avoidance of this explanation. Years have passed since he knew from me what his situation here was. The kindness you have secretly done for his advancement, and then disclosed to me for my surprise and pleasure, have been, you will believe, but aggravations of the unhappiness and burden of my secret." She sunk down gently at the doctor's feet, though he did his utmost to prevent her, and said, looking up tearfully into his face, "Do not speak to me yet. Let me say a little more. Right or wrong, if this were to be done again, I think I should do just the same. You never can know what it was to be devoted to you, with those old associations, to find that anyone could be so hard as to suppose that the truth of my heart was bartered away, and to be surrounded by appearances confirming that belief. I was very young, and had no adviser. Between mamma and me, in all relating to you, there was a wide division. If I shrunk into myself, hiding the disrespect I had undergone, it was because I honoured you so much, and so much wished that you should honour me." "Annie, my poor heart," said the doctor, "my dear girl." "A little more, a very few words more. I used to think there were so many whom you might have married, who would not have brought such charge and trouble on you. I used to be afraid that I had better have remained your pupil, and almost your child. I used to fear that I was so unsuited to your learning and wisdom. If all this made me shrink within myself, as indeed it did, when I had that to tell, it was still because I honoured you so much, and hoped that you might one day honour me." "That day has shone this long time, Annie," said the doctor, "and can have but one long night, my dear." "Another word, I afterwards meant, steadfastly meant, and purposed to myself, to bear the whole weight of knowing the unworthiness of one to whom you have been so good. And now a last word, dearest and best of friends. The cause of the late change in you, which I have seen with so much pain and sorrow, and have sometimes referred to my old apprehension, at other times to lingering suppositions nearer to the truth, has been made clear to-night, and by an accident I have also come to know to-night the full measure of your noble trust in me, even under that mistake. I do not hope that any love and duty I may render in return will ever make me worthy of your priceless confidence. But with all this knowledge fresh upon me, I can lift my eyes to this dear face, revered as a father's, loved as a husband's, sacred to me in my childhood as a friend's, and solemnly declare that in my lightest thought I have never wronged you, never wavered in the love and the fidelity I owe you. She had her arms around the doctor's neck, and he leaned his head down over her, mingling his grey hair with her dark brown tresses. "Oh, hold me to your heart, my husband. Never cast me out. Do not think or speak of disparity between us, for there is none, except in all my imperfections. Every succeeding year I have known this better, as I have esteemed you more and more. Oh, take me to your heart, my husband, for my love is founded on a rock, and it endures." In the silence that ensued, my aunt walked gravely up to Mr. Dick, without at all hurrying herself, and gave him a hug and a sounding kiss. And it was very fortunate, with a view to his credit, that she did so, for I am confident that I detected him in that moment in the act of making preparations to stand on one leg, as an appropriate expression of delight. "You are a very remarkable man, Dick," said my aunt, with an air of unqualified approbation, "and never pretend to be anything else, for I know better." With that my aunt pulled him by the sleeve, and nodded to me, and we three stole quietly out of the room and came away. "That's a settler for our military friend, at any rate," said my aunt on the way home. "I should sleep the better for that, if there was nothing else to be glad of." "She was quite overcome, I am afraid," said Mr. Dick, with great commiseration. "What, did you ever see a crocodile overcome?" inquired my aunt. "I don't think I ever saw a crocodile," returned Mr. Dick mildly. "There never would have been anything the matter if it hadn't been for that old animal," said my aunt, with strong emphasis. "It's very much to be wished that some mothers would leave their daughters alone after marriage, and not be so violently affectionate. They seem to think the only return that can be made for bringing an unfortunate young woman into the world, God bless my soul, as if she asked to be brought, or wanted to come, is full liberty to worry her out of it again. What are you thinking of, Trot?" I was thinking of all that had been said. My mind was still running on some of the expressions used. There can be no disparity in marriage like unsuitability of mind and purpose, the first mistaken impulse of an undisciplined heart. My love was founded on a rock. But we were at home, and the trodden leaves were lying underfoot, and the autumn wind was blowing. End of chapter 45. Of David Copperfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 46. Intelligence. I must have been married, if I may trust to my imperfect memory for dates, about a year or so, when one evening, as I was returning from a solitary walk, thinking of the book I was then writing, for my success had steadily increased with my steady application, and I was engaged at that time upon my first work of fiction, I came past Mrs. Steerforth's house. I had often passed it before, during my residence in that neighbourhood, though never when I could choose another road. Howbeit, it did sometimes happen that it was not easy to find another without making a long circuit, and so I had passed that way, upon the whole, pretty often. I had never done more than glance at the house as I went by with a quickened step. It had been uniformly gloomy and dull. None of the best rooms abutted on the road, and the narrow, heavily framed, old-fashioned windows, never cheerful under any circumstances, looked very dismal, closed shut, and with their blinds always drawn down. There was a covered way across a little paved court to an entrance that was never used, and there was one round staircase window at odds with all the rest, and the only one unshaded by a blind, which had the same unoccupied blank look. I do not remember that I ever saw a light in all the house.
If I had been a casual passer-by, I should have probably supposed that some childless person lay dead in it. If I had happily possessed no knowledge of the place, and seen it often in that changeless state, I should have pleased my fancy with many ingenious speculations, I dare say. As it was, I thought as little of it as I might, but my mind could not go by it and leave it as my body did, and it usually awakened a long train of meditations. Coming before me on this particular evening that I mention, mingled with the childish recollections and later fancies, the ghosts of half-formed hopes, the broken shadows of disappointments dimly seen and understood, the blending of experience and imagination, incidental to the occupation with which my thoughts had been busy, it was more than commonly suggestive. I fell into a brown study as I walked on, and a voice at my side made me start. It was a woman's voice too. I was not long in recollecting Mrs. Steerforth's little parlour-maid, who had formerly worn blue ribbons in her cap. She had taken them out now, to adapt herself, I suppose, to the altered character of the house, and wore but one or two disconsolate bows of sober brown. "If you please, sir, would you have the goodness to walk in and speak to Miss Dartle?" "Has Miss Dartle sent you for me?" I inquired. "Not to-night, sir, but it's just the same. Miss Dartle saw you pass a night or two ago, and I was to sit at work on the staircase, and when I saw you pass again, to ask you to step in and speak to her." I turned back, and inquired of my conductor as we went along how Mrs. Steerforth was. She said her lady was but poorly, and kept to her own room a good deal. When we arrived at the house, I was directed to Miss Dartle in the garden, and left to make my presence known to her myself. She was sitting on a seat at one end of a kind of terrace overlooking the great city. It was a sombre evening, with a lurid light in the sky, and as I saw the prospect scowling in the distance, with here and there some larger object starting up into the sullen glare, I fancied it was no inapt companion to the memory of this fierce woman. She saw me as I advanced, and rose for a moment to receive me. I thought her then still more colourless and thin than when I had seen her last, the flashing eyes still brighter, and the scar still plainer. Our meeting was not cordial. We had parted angrily on the last occasion, and there was an air of disdain about her, which she took no pains to conceal. "I am told you wish to speak to me, Miss Dartle," said I, standing near her, with my hand upon the back of the seat, and declining her gesture of invitation to sit down. "If you please," said she. "Pray, has this girl been found?" "No." "And yet she has run away." I saw her thin lips working while she looked at me, as if they were eager to load her with reproaches. "Run away?" I repeated. "Yes, from him," she said with a laugh. "If she's not found, perhaps she never will be found. She may be dead." The vaunting cruelty with which she met my glance I never saw expressed in any other face that I have ever seen. "To wish her dead," said I, "may be the kindest wish that one of her own sex could bestow upon her. I am glad that time has softened you so much, Miss Dartle." She condescended to make no reply, but turning on me with another scornful laugh, said, "The friends of this excellent and much injured young lady are friends of yours. You are their companion, and assert their rights. Do you wish to know what is known of her?" "Yes," said I. She rose with an ill-favoured smile, and taking a few steps towards a wall of holly that was near at hand, dividing the lawn from a kitchen garden, said in a louder voice, "Come here," as if she were calling some unclean beast. "You will restrain any demonstrative championship or vengeance in this place, of course, Mr. Copperfield," said she, looking over her shoulder at me with the same expression. I inclined my head without knowing what she meant. She said, "Come here," again, and returned, followed by the respectable Mr. Littimer, who, with undiminished respectability, made me a bow and took up his position behind her. The air of wicked grace, of triumph, in which, strange to say, there was yet something feminine and alluring, with which she reclined upon the seat between us and looked at me, was worthy of a cruel princess in a legend. "Now," she said imperiously, without glancing at him, and touching the old wound as it throbbed, perhaps in this instance with pleasure rather than pain, "tell Mr. Copperfield about the flight." "Mr. James and myself, ma'am—" "Don't address yourself to me," she interrupted with a frown. "Mr. James and myself, sir—" "Nor to me, if you please," said I. Mr. Littimer, without being at all discomposed, signified by a slight obeisance that anything that was most agreeable to us was most agreeable to him, and began again. Mr. James and myself have been abroad with the young woman ever since she left Yarmouth under Mr. James's protection. We have been in a variety of places, and seen a deal of foreign country. We have been in France, Switzerland, Italy, in fact, almost all parts. He looked at the back of the seat, as if he were addressing himself to that, and softly played upon it with his hands, as if he were striking chords upon a dumb piano. Mr. James took quite uncommonly to the young woman, and was more settled, for a long time, than I have known him to be since I have been in his service. The young woman was very improvable, and spoke the languages, and wouldn't have been known for the same country person. I noticed that she was much admired wherever we went. Miss Dartle put her hand upon her side. I saw him steal a glance at her, and slightly smile to himself. Very much admired indeed, the young woman was. What with her dress, what with the air and sun, what with being made so much of, what with this, that, and the other, her merits really attracted general notice. He made a short pause, her eyes wandered restlessly over the distant prospect, and she bit her nether lip to stop that busy mouth. Taking his hands from the seat, and placing one of them within the other as he settled himself on one leg, Mr. Littimer proceeded, with his eyes cast down and his respectable head a little advanced, and a little on one side. The young woman went on in this manner for some time, being occasionally low in spirits, until I think she began to weary Mr. James by giving way to her low spirits and tempers of that kind, and things were not so comfortable. Mr. James, he began to be restless again. The more restless he got, the worse she got, and I must say for myself that I had a very difficult time of it indeed between the two. Still matters were patched up here and made good there, over and over again, and altogether lasted, I'm sure, for a longer time than anybody could have expected. Recalling her eyes from the distance, she looked at me again now with her former air. Mr. Littimer, clearing his throat behind his hand with a respectable short cough, changed legs and went on. At last, when there had been, upon the whole, a good many words and reproaches, Mr. James set off one morning from the neighbourhood of Naples, where we had a villa, the young woman being very partial to the sea, and under pretence of coming back in a day or so, left it in charge with me to break it out that, for the general happiness of all concerned, he was— here an interruption of the short cough— gone. But Mr. James, I must say, certainly did behave extremely honourable, for he proposed that the young woman should marry a very respectable person, who was fully prepared to overlook the past, and who was at least as good as anybody the young woman could have aspired to in a regular way, her connections being very common. He changed legs again and wetted his lips. I was convinced that the scoundrel spoke of himself, and I saw my conviction reflected in Miss Dartle's face. This I also had it in charge to communicate. I was willing to do anything to relieve Mr. James from his difficulty, and to restore harmony between himself and an affectionate parent, who has undergone so much on his account. Therefore I undertook the commission. The young woman's violence, when she came to, after I broke the fact of this departure, was beyond all expectations. She was quite mad, and had to be held by force, or, if she couldn't have got to a knife, or got to the sea, she'd have beaten her head against the marble floor. Miss Dartle, leaning back upon the seat, with a light of exultation in her face, seemed almost to caress the sounds this fellow had uttered. When I came to the second part of what had been entrusted to me, said Mr. Littimer, rubbing his hands uneasily, which anybody might have supposed to have been, at all events, appreciated as a kind intention, the young woman came out in her true colours. A more outrageous person I never did see. Her conduct was surprisingly bad. She had no more gratitude, no more feeling, no more patience, no more reason in her than a stock or a stone. If I hadn't been upon my guard, I am convinced she would have had my blood. I think the better of her for it, said I indignantly. Mr. Littimer bent his head, as much as to say, Indeed, sir, but you are young, and resumed his narrative.
It was necessary, in short, for a time, to take away everything nigh her that she could do herself or anybody else an injury with, and to shut her up close. Notwithstanding which, she got out in the night, forced the lattice of the window that I had nailed up myself, dropped on a vine that was trailed below, and never was seen or heard of, to my knowledge, since. She is dead, perhaps,' said Miss Dartle, with a smile, as if she could have spurned the body of the ruined girl. 'She may have drowned herself, miss,' returned Mr. Littimer, catching at an excuse for addressing himself to somebody. 'It's very possible. Or she may have had assistance from the boatmen, and the boatmen's wives and children. Being given to low company, she was very much in the habit of talking to them on the beach, Miss Dartle, and sitting by their boats. I have known her to do it when Mr. James has been away, whole days. Mr. James was far from pleased to find out once that she had told the children she was a boatman's daughter, and that in her own country, long ago, she had roamed about the beach like them. O Emily, unhappy beauty! What a picture rose before me, of her sitting on the far off shore among the children like herself when she was innocent, listening to little voices as might have called her mother had she been a poor man's wife, and to the great voice of the sea with its eternal nevermore. When it was clear that nothing could be done, Miss Dartle— "Did I tell you not to speak to me?" she said with stern contempt. "You spoke to me, miss," he replied. "I beg your pardon, but it's my service to obey." "Do your service," she returned. "Finish your story and go." "When it was clear," he said, with infinite respectability and obedient bow, "that she was not to be found, I went to Mr. James, at the place where it had been arranged that I should write to him, and informed him of what had occurred. Words passed between us in consequence, and I felt it due to my character to leave him. I could bear, and I have borne, a great deal from Mr. James. But he insulted me too far. He hurt me. Knowing the unfortunate difference between himself and his mother, and what her anxiety of mind was likely to be, I took the liberty of coming home to England and relating—" "For money which I paid him," said Miss Dartle to me. "Just so, madam, and relating what I knew. I am not aware," said Mr. Littimer, after a moment's reflection, "that there is anything else. I am at present out of employment, and should be happy to meet with a respectable situation." Miss Dartle glanced at me, as though she would inquire if there were anything that I desired to ask. As there was something which had occurred to my mind, I said in reply— "I could wish to know from this creature—" I could not bring myself to utter any more conciliatory word— "whether they intercepted a letter that was written to her from home, or whether he supposes that she received it." He remained calm and silent, with his eyes fixed on the ground, and the tip of every finger of his right hand delicately poised against the tip of every finger of his left. Miss Dartle turned her head disdainfully towards him. "I beg your pardon, miss," he said, awakening from his abstraction, "but however submissive to you, I have my position, though a servant. Mr. Copperfield and you, miss, are different people. If Mr. Copperfield wishes to know anything from me, I take the liberty of reminding Mr. Copperfield that he can put a question to me. I have a character to maintain." After a momentary struggle with myself, I turned my eyes upon him and said— "You have heard my question. Consider it addressed to yourself if you choose. What answer do you make?" "Sir," he rejoined, with an occasional separation and reunion of those delicate tips, "my answer must be qualified, because to betray Mr. James's confidence to his mother and to betray it to you are two different actions. It is not probable, I consider, that Mr. James would encourage the receipt of letters likely to increase low spirits and unpleasantness, but further than that, sir, I should wish to avoid going." "Is that all?" inquired Miss Dartle of me. I indicated that I had nothing more to say. "Except," I added, as I saw him moving off, "that I understand this fellow's part in the wicked story, and that as I shall make it known to the honest man who has been her father from her childhood, I should recommend him to avoid going too much into public." He had stopped the moment I began, and had listened with his usual repose of manner. "Thank you, sir. But you'll excuse me if I say, sir, that there are neither slaves nor slave drivers in this country, and that people are not allowed to take the law into their own hands. If they do, it is more to their own peril, I believe, than to other people's. Consequently speaking, I am not at all afraid of going wherever I may wish, sir." With that he made a polite bow, and with another to Miss Dartle went away through the arch in the wall of holly by which he had come. Miss Dartle and I regarded each other for a little while in silence, her manner being exactly what it was when she had produced the man. "He says besides," she observed with a slow curling of her lip, "that his master, as he hears, is coasting Spain, and this done is a way to gratify his seafaring tastes till he is weary. But this is of no interest to you. Between these two proud persons, mother and son, there is a wider breach than before, and little hope of its healing, for they are one at heart, and time makes each more obstinate and imperious. Neither is this of any interest to you, but it introduces what I wish to say. The devil whom you make an angel of, I mean this low girl whom he picked out of the tide mud, with her black eyes full upon me and her passionate finger up, may be alive, for I believe some common things are hard to die. If she is, you will desire to have a pearl of such price found and taken care of. We desire that too, that he may not by any chance be made her prey again. So far we are united in one interest, and that is why I, who would do her any mischief that so coarse a wretch is capable of feeling, have sent for you to hear what you have heard." I saw by the change in her face that someone was advancing behind me. It was Mrs. Steerforth, who gave me her hand more coldly than of yore, and with an augmentation of her former stateliness of manner. But still I perceived, and I was touched by it, with an ineffaceable remembrance of my old love for her son. She was greatly altered. Her fine figure was far less upright, her handsome face was deeply marked, and her hair was almost white. But when she sat down on the seat she was a handsome lady still, and well I knew the bright eye with its lofty look that had been a light in my very dreams at school. "Is Mr. Copperfield informed of everything, Rosa?" "Yes." "And has he heard Littimer himself?" "Yes. I have told him why you wished it. You are a good girl. I have had some slight correspondence with your former friend, sir," addressing me, "but it has not restored his sense of duty or natural obligation. Therefore I have no other object in this than what Rosa has mentioned. If by the course which may relieve the mind of the decent man you brought here, for whom I am sorry, I can say no more, my son may be saved from again falling into the snares of a designing enemy, well—" She drew herself up and sat looking straight before her, far away. "Madam," said I respectfully, "I understand. I assure you I am in no danger of putting any strained construction on your motives. But I must say, even to you, having known this injured family from childhood, that if you suppose the girl, so deeply wronged, has not been cruelly deluded, and would not rather die 100 deaths than take a cup of water from your son's hand now, you cherish a terrible mistake." "Well, Rosa, well," said Mrs. Steerforth, as the other was about to interpose, "it is no matter. Let it be. You are married, sir, I am told?" I answered that I had been some time married. "And are doing well? I hear little in the quiet life I lead, but I understand you are beginning to be famous." "I have been quite fortunate," I said, "and find my name connected with some praise." "You have no mother?" in a softened voice. "No." "It's a pity," she returned. "She would have been proud of you. Good night." I took the hand she held out with a dignified, unbending air, and it was as calm in mine as if her breast had been at peace. Her pride could still its very pulses, it appeared, and draw the placid veil before her face, through which she sat looking straight before her on the far distance. As I moved away from them along the terrace, I could not help observing how steadily they both sat gazing upon the prospect, and how it thickened and closed around them. Here and there some early lamps were seen to twinkle in the distant city, and in the eastern quarter of the sky the lurid lights still hovered. But from the greater part of the broad valley interposed, a mist was rising like a sea, which, mingling with the darkness, made it seem as if the gathering waters would encompass them. I have reason to remember this, and think of it with awe, for before I looked upon those two again, a stormy sea had risen to their feet. Reflecting on what had been thus told me, I felt it right that it should be communicated to Mr. Peggotty. On the following evening I went into London in quest of him. He was always wandering about from place to place, with his one object of recovering his niece before him, but was more in London than elsewhere. Often and often now I see him in the dead of night passing along the streets, searching among the few who loitered out of doors at those untimely hours, for what he dreaded to find. He kept a lodging over the little chandler's shop in Hungerford Market, which I have had occasion to mention more than once, and from which he first went forth upon his errand of mercy. Hither I directed my walk. On making inquiry for him, I learned from the people of the house that he had not gone out yet, and I should find him in his room upstairs. He was getting ready by a window in which he kept a few plants. The room was very neat and orderly, and I saw in a moment that it was always kept prepared for her reception, and that he never went out but he thought it possible he might bring her home. He had not heard my tap at the door, and only raised his eyes when I laid my hand upon his shoulder. "Master Davy, thank ye, sir, thank ye hearty for this visit. Sit ye down. You're kindly welcome, sir." "Mr. Peggotty," said I, taking the chair he handed me, "don't expect much. I have heard some news." "Of Em'ly?" He put his hand in a nervous manner on his mouth and turned pale as he fixed his eyes upon mine. "It gives no clue to where she is, but she is not with him." He sat down, looking intently at me, and listened in profound silence to all I had to tell. I well remember the sense of dignity, beauty even, with which the patient gravity of his face impressed me, when, having gradually removed his eyes from mine, he sat looking downward, leaning his forehead on his hand. He offered no interruption, but remained throughout perfectly still. He seemed to pursue her figure throughout the narrative, and to let every other shape go by him as if it were nothing. When I had done, he shaded his face and continued silent. I looked out of the window for a little while, and occupied myself with the plants. "How do you fare to feel about it, Master Davy?" he inquired at length. "I think that she is living," I replied. "I don't know. Maybe the first shock was too rough, and in the wildness of her heart. That there blue water as she used to speak on, could she have thought of that so many years, because it was to be her grave?" He said this, musing in a low, frightened voice, and walked across the little room. "And yet," he added, "Master Davy, I have felt so sure as she was living, I have knowed, awake and sleeping, as it was so true that I should find her. I have been so led on by it, and so held up by it, that I don't believe I can have been deceived. No, Emily's alive." He put his hand down firmly on the table, and set his sunburnt face into a resolute expression. "My niece Emily is alive, sir," he said steadfastly. "I don't know where it comes from, or how it is, but I am told as she's alive." He looked almost like a man inspired as he said it. I waited for a few moments until he could give me his undivided attention, and then proceeded to explain the precaution that, it occurred to me at least, it might be wise to take. "Now, my dear friend," I began. Thank ye, kind sir," he said, grasping my hand in both of his. "If she should make her way to London, which is likely, for where could she lose herself so readily as in this vast city? And what would she wish to do but lose and hide herself if she does not go home?" "And she won't go home," he interposed, shaking his head mournfully. "If she had left of her own accord she might, not as it was, sir." "If she should come here," said I believe there is one person here more likely to discover her than any other in the world. Do you remember, hear what I say with fortitude, think of your great object, do you remember Martha?" "Of our town?" I needed no other answer than his face. "Do you know that she is in London?" "I have seen her in the streets," he answered with a shiver. "But you don't know," said I, "that Emily was charitable to her with Ham's help long before she fled from home, nor that when we met one night and spoke together in the room yonder, over the way, she listened at the door?" "Master Davy," he replied in astonishment, "that night when it snew so hard?" "That night. I have never seen her since. I went back after parting from you to speak to her, but she was gone. I was unwilling to mention her to you then, and I am now. But she is the person of whom I speak, and with whom I think we should communicate. Do you understand?" "Too well, sir," he replied. We had sunk our voices almost to a whisper, and continued to speak in that tone. "You say you have seen her. Do you think that you could find her? I could only hope to do so by chance." "I think, Master Davy, I know where to look." "It is dark. Being together, shall we go out now and try to find her tonight?" He assented, and prepared to accompany me. Without appearing to observe what he was doing, I saw how carefully he adjusted the little room, put a candle ready and the means of lighting it, arranged the bed, and finally took out of a drawer one of her dresses. I remember to have seen her wear it, neatly folded with some other garments, and a bonnet, which he placed upon a chair. He made no allusion to these clothes, neither did I. There they had been waiting for her many and many a night, no doubt. "The time was, Master Davy," he said, as we came downstairs, "when I thought this girl, Martha, almost like the dirt underneath my Emily's feet. God forgive me, there's a difference now." As we went along, partly to hold him in conversation, and partly to satisfy myself, I asked him about Ham. He said almost the same words as formerly, that Ham was just the same, wearing away his life with kinder no care nohow for it, but never murmuring and liked by all. I asked him what he thought Ham's state of mind was, in reference to the cause of their misfortunes, whether he believed it was dangerous, what he supposed, for example, Ham would do if he and Steerforth ever should encounter. "I don't know, sir," he replied. "I have thought of it oftentimes, but I can't adwise myself of it no matters." I recalled to his remembrance the morning after her departure, when we were all three on the beach. "Do you recollect," I said, "a certain wild way in which he looked out to sea, and spoke about the end of it?" "Sure I do," he said. "And what do you suppose he meant?" "Master Davy," he replied, "I've put the question to myself a mort of times, and never found no answer. And there's one curious thing, that though he's so pleasant, I wouldn't feel comfortable to try and get his mind upon't. He never said a word to me as warn't as dutiful could be, and it ain't likely as he'd begin to speak any other ways now. But it's far from being fleet water in his mind, where them thoughts lays. It's deep, sir, and I can't see down." "You are right," said I, "and that has sometimes made me anxious." "And me too, Master Davy," he rejoined. "Even more so, I do assure you, than his venturesome ways, though both belongs to the alteration in him. I do't know as he'd do violence under any circumstance, but I hope as them two may be kept asunders." We had come through Temple Bar into the city. Conversing no more now, and walking at my side, he yielded himself up to the one aim of his devoted life, and went on with that hushed concentration of his faculties which would have made his figure solitary in a multitude. We were not far from Blackfriars Bridge, when he turned his head and pointed to a solitary female figure flitting along the opposite side of the street. I knew it readily to be the figure that we sought. We crossed the road and were pressing on towards her, when it occurred to me that she might be more disposed to feel a woman's interest in the lost girl if we spoke to her in a quiet place, aloof from the crowd, and where she should be less observed. I advised my companion, therefore, that we should not address her yet, but follow her, consulting in this likewise an indistinct desire I had to know where she went. He acquiescing, we followed at a distance, never losing sight of her, but never caring to come very near, as she frequently looked about. Once she stopped to listen to a band of music, and then we stopped too. She went on a long way. Still we went on. It was evident from the manner in which she held her course that she was going to some fixed destination, and this, and her keeping in the busy streets, and I suppose the strange fascination in the secrecy and mystery of so following anyone, made me adhere to my first purpose. At length she turned into a dull dark street, where the noise and crowd were lost, and I said, "We may speak to her now," and mending our pace, we went after her. Chapter 46